Good evening. Hi, friends. It's wonderful to be back. To all of my Ner Tamid friends, it's really a delight to be with you. And to all of my friends in the larger community, thank you for being here this evening and for giving me the privilege of coming to talk and teach and share with you a little bit. In particular, it's been a wonderful reunion for me this evening to visit with Reinhard and to visit with Jonathan. I remember those early days when we really were sharing so much together in community, and I must say that those relationships and experiences have not been repeated in the journey of my career. And so it's really, really very special for me to come home, if you will, and to share this experience with all of you. I'm going to take a few minutes and speak somewhat formally, and then I'm going to bring the microphone and come down, and we're going to do some learning and some thinking together. I want to set a context for our discussion this evening, and so in order to set this context, I want to ask you a few questions. You don't have to answer the questions to me, but I want you to think about these questions. They start really easy. Do you prefer chocolate or vanilla ice cream? It's your choice. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? Don't tell me. Do you drive a Tesla or a Toyota? Okay, so those are choice questions, right? Now I want you to answer these questions. Do you love your mother or your father? Do you care more about religious or secular people? Do you care more about Americans or people of all nationalities? We'll call these either-or questions. Some either-or questions are simply a matter of choice. Some are a matter of ethics. When asked, we ought to choose right, not wrong, good, not bad, fair, not unfair. But other kinds of either-or questions present definitions of who we are and how we choose to act in the world. So if I choose one parent over the other, it reflects a problematic situation in my family or something disturbing in my own upbringing. If I say I care about religious people, it sounds as if I don't care enough for humanity. If I say I care for people of all nationalities, it sounds as if I do not sufficiently care about Americans. These type of either-or questions are traps. A healthier outlook on life is usually more nuanced, and certainly more nuanced than an either-or choice. We can see God in nature and beyond nature. The biblical prophets seek ritual and justice, national pride and compassion. Each of us here this evening affirms the truths of our particular faiths and seeks to understand and gain insights from our neighbors' religious traditions. So with that as context, think about the discussions and the controversies engaging us these days. In a sense, we're in the midst of a series of either-or debates and tensions, and we need to come through that. So try to answer these next questions for yourselves. And then, if you want to have some fun, later on, try these questions with family and friends. I suspect you're in for an interesting, if not energetic, dialogue. Can I disrespect an elected leader, agree or disagree with his or her policies, and still love my country? Can I maintain my relationships with family and neighbors who support what I oppose or oppose what I support? Can I profess pride in my ethnic, cultural, or religious identity and protest racial bias toward others where I find it? Can I agree with you about the facts and disagree with you about their implication? Can I believe in equal justice under the law and express partisan preference? Does validating someone else's experience diminish my own? Can I hold different feelings simultaneously? These are hard questions. And all of us feel them in a whole variety of ways, personally and communally. And in my line of work, and I imagine it's true for Jonathan in this pulpit, in my line of work, at this time of either-or debates, it is very challenging to teach social ethics, which is the public purpose of religious values and Bible study. It is challenging to teach social ethics and religion's moral vision because it is hard to be heard as respecting the different and strongly held ideological views among us. I choose to think that we're capable of better. I choose to believe that we're capable of more. I can't and I won't accept the devolution of culture and social discourse present in these false choices. I will not sacrifice an ideal in a clash about what is real. So you see, my answer to each of these difficult either-or questions is yes. Is the only way to affirm who I am to minimize who you are? Am I the only source of good ideas? Is mine the only valid claim? Of course not. I reject the absolutism of these false dichotomies. The actual response to all of these complex questions is not either or. The actual answer is both and. Both and. Kindness is not a choice. Neither are honesty, compassion, and human dignity. All of our religious traditions teach us to use words carefully and to act with integrity. Ethics, equality, goodness, justice, honesty, compassion, respect, these are not modern inventions. These are not liberal or conservative inclinations. They are not optional pursuits. They are part of our core purpose as we live with religious values in the world. And so I want to invite you now to join me in studying a few biblical and rabbinic texts that affirm the pluralism of which I am speaking and guide us in the form our debates and disagreements ought to take. I look forward to learning about this subject from the text of Christianity and Islam as well, and all of the other religious and faith traditions. I, however, am not qualified to teach those traditions, so I now am going to take you on a journey through biblical and rabbinic texts that portray what I've outlined for you. Bob, do we have the study sheets?
We will do it.
And I'm going to come down to be close to everybody. Thank you. Oh, much better now. I can see you. Very good. So what's being distributed are a series of texts. We'll see how many we can work through. 2 biblical texts and a variety of what I call a text from Jewish tradition, rabbinic texts. I'll introduce them to you. Everything in confusing English and everything there for us to think about together. And until they're all distributed, we'll sing a song. the other guy, the other side guy, the other side. So the first text is the famous moment in the book of Genesis when God informs Abraham that he's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Amorah, Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm sure it's a story with which we are all familiar. I want to look at that text for the beginning of our journey this evening. Genesis chapter 18, beginning with verse 17. Now the eternal God had said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him." This in and of itself is a remarkable statement. God seems to have a vision and a plan. God is concerned about the corruption or the bad behavior that he sees in Sodom and Gomorrah. Not fully explained in the biblical text what the problem is, but nevertheless, God seems to have a concern. So rather than just acting, God says, should I check in with Abraham? He's my agent down there on the ground. He's the one whom I've said is really the father of the multitude of the nations. Do I owe Abraham a heads up about what I'm going to do? It's a remarkable statement in the character presented here as God. But if you do that, you're opening yourself up to a response. I remember once an employer said to me, "Are you asking me or telling me that you won't be here next week?" There'll be one consequence if you're telling me, and there'll be a different thought if you're asking me. You open yourself up. Right? So, God goes on to explain, "I have singled Abraham out that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the eternal God by doing what is just and right, in order that the eternal God may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." So, he then decides it's so great in Sodom and Gomorrah the outrage that he must go down. He goes down, he talks to Abraham, and Abraham says what? Exactly right. We're coming to that. First, Abraham says, "You're going to sweep away the innocent people with the bad? Is that what you intend, God?" God asked for this. He said, "Should I check in?" Abraham says, "What if there should be 50 innocent people within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it?" And you know the story goes on. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, 5. But we'll just take the 50 for our purposes this evening, because it's verse 25 that is the verse. Abraham looks at God and shouts, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you." I have to say, I brought you English translation. In my tradition, the Hebrew is much richer. The Hebrew says, "Shame on you." That's how the Hebrew is really translated. Shame on you. Chalila lecha. Shame on you. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? One of the most important moral statements that biblical literature provides us, because this is a moment where we're told conscience matters. This is a moment when we're told it's okay to challenge authority. This is a moment where we're told it takes courage, but courage is invited in order to stand for a principle that you need to advocate for. So this sets up for us, if we're going to think about how to debate and how to disagree, this sets up for us the right to enter into that debate. If you see an injustice, no matter its authority, you have license to challenge it. The question is going to be, how? How do you bring that challenge? Which brings me to the most famous text in the book of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, wherein authority is challenged in a difficult way. And this comes to us from the book of Numbers, chapter 16, where there is a priest named Korach. And Korach leads a rebellion against Moses. The children of Israel are wandering in the wilderness. They're in the midst of their journey from the freedom that they have received during the Exodus on their way to the land of Israel. And in the midst of their journey, Korach questions Moses' authority to lead the people. So it tells us there in verse 1, Korach is the son of Ishar, the son of Kohat. All that's doing is establishing that he comes from a privileged lineage. He's not just one of the people, he's one of the Levites, one of the priestly group. So he himself already has a certain stature in the hierarchy of the community. And he, along with his sons and others, descendants, rise up against Moses together with 250 Israelites. And who are the people bringing this uprising? Chieftains of the community, chosen in the assembly, men of repute. This is an uprising, a rebellion by a leadership class. This is not just the masses saying they don't like the leadership. This is part of the leadership saying it doesn't like the leadership. This is a very serious challenge to Moses. They're trying to govern these people wandering in the wilderness. And in verse 3, they combined against Moses and his brother Aaron, and they said to them, "You have gone too far. For all the community are holy, all of them, and the eternal God is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourselves above the eternal God's congregation?" Korach's complaint, I would suggest, is correct. He's actually right. Everybody is sacred and precious. Everybody has their opportunity to have a relationship with God. Everybody in this community matters. Who made you the boss? It's not like they knew about democratic principles back then. But who put you in charge? Now, if you're Moses and you're hearing that, what's your problem? Moses didn't want this job either. Who put Moses in charge? God. In the Bible, that's a different kind of dynamic. So Moses has but one choice. When he heard this, he fell on his face, meaning he was upset. And then he spoke to Korach and all his company. He said, "Come morning, the eternal God will make known who is his and who is holy, and will grant him access to God's self, and will grant access to the one he has chosen." Look, I'm not going to define this. I'm not going to debate this with you. God will decide. Because Moses knows too, I suspect, I don't know, but my reading of this story, Moses actually knows the core of Korach's question is correct. But he also knows this isn't in his hands to decide. So how does it get resolved? Well, they challenge themselves to a duel, if you will. Okay? Moses says, "Bring your fire pans to the altar where we do our ritual work, and we'll see which one's flames God accepts and receives, and God will make known what's supposed to happen." So if you turn to page 2, Moses offers a response to Korach's challenge. "Is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has set you apart from the community of Israel and given you access to him to perform the duties of the eternal God's tabernacle and to minister to the community and serve them? You already, by the way, are in a very special, exalted position. Is that not enough? You want more? Now that God has advanced you and all your fellow Levites with you, do you seek the priesthood too, meaning Aaron's job and then Moses' job? Truly it is against the eternal God that you and your company have branded together, for who is Aaron that you should rail against him?" So you'll read through if you want. I don't want to take the time to read the whole text because I want to move forward, but you'll see they challenge themselves to this kind of what I call, just to be fun, a duel of bringing their fire pans to the altar, and we see what happens in verse 22. The presence of the eternal God appeared to the whole community. That's just up above at the end of 19. And the eternal God spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Stand back from this community that I may annihilate them in an instant." Might be a bit of an overreaction. I don't know. But they fell on their faces. And then again, that means they were upset. On their faces, and they said, "O God, source of the breath of all flesh, when one man sins, will you be wrathful with the whole community?" Where have I heard this? Where have I heard this? Right? That's Abraham's challenge. We challenge authority when we think authority is morally wrong. So yes, I was challenged by Korach, God, but is this the right response? And if you read what happens, God determines, yes, it is the right response. And the earth opens up, as a good Bible story tells, and swallows up all of those who are in rebellion, and Moses' leadership of Israel is reestablished. Now, why am I sharing this story with you? I'm actually sharing the story with you not because of the story. I'm sharing the story with you because of how my faith tradition decided to read this story in teaching people how to have an argument. And that's my subject here. How is it that we are supposed to have an argument? So if you'll turn to page 3. We have a wonderful text in Jewish tradition called the Ethics of the Fathers. The Ethics of the Fathers is a collection of ethical wisdom statements by the early sages of Jewish tradition who were forming the rabbinic tradition which became Judaism. It's a collection of all sorts of important moral, ethical, communal statements. Some of the most famous that probably are known generally: if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not, now when, as it finishes. So here is a statement. Every argument that is for the sake of heaven's name is destined to endure. But if it is not for the sake of heaven's name, it is not destined to endure. What would be an argument for the sake of heaven's name? For God's sake? What would be that kind of an argument? I don't know if it's an argument, it's an important moral direction, right? Thou shalt not murder. Okay, so an argument for God's sake, for the sake of heaven, would be, as our tradition understands this text, would be an argument where you and I disagree about how to get there, but our goal is the same. We're trying to be constructive. We're trying to achieve something. We're trying to make a difference. We just happen to have a different path to getting there. And so we're going to debate and argue our different policy or our different path, but we share the goal. We share the vision. Something good, we hope, will come of this argument that we will both ultimately see as having been the right outcome. We're just not sure that we know or that we agree on what path to take. What would be the example of an argument that isn't for heaven's sake? The opposite of that. We don't agree on the outcome that we desire, and so arguing about what policy or what method or what approach to take is really a pointless argument because we're not trying to achieve the same thing. First, we have to know what we're trying to achieve. The context for an argument has to be, what outcome are you seeking? So look at the example that they bring. Where am I deriving this from? What's an example of an argument for the sake of heaven's name? Well, we're going to learn that argument in a minute. It's the argument of two rabbinic sages, Hillel and Shammai. We're going to come to that in a moment. But what is an example of an argument not for the sake of heaven's name? The argument of Korach and his congregation. Korach's argument was not, gee, Moses, something's not working for the community, And we have a different method of getting there, and we would like a turn in the leadership now because we think we can take the next 40 years' journey more effectively than you can, but yes, we're all going to the same promised land. Korach's argument was, who put you in charge? I want the job. It's not about sharing the ends, it's about wanting the power. And so while you might read with our modern sensibilities God's reaction to Korach as a bit overwhelming, my tradition reads it as an example of how not to have an argument. It can't be about the power. It can't be about the authority. It can't be about insisting I'm right. It has to be about arguing toward a shared vision of an outcome. Which brings me to what Hillel and Shammai, two very famous and important rabbinic sages, argued about. So look with me now at text 4. This is a Talmudic statement. It tells us, when those with boastful hearts proliferated. What's a boastful heart? A boastful heart is, in this case, as our tradition means these words, people who didn't listen to or respect each other or their teachers. So when you start the argument with an arrogant sense that your folks don't know what they're talking about, but only my team and my folks do, you're probably not going to have a very constructive argument. And you're probably going to sow division. I know this never happens in the real world. But in the world of the first century of the Roman Empire, where the rabbis are living and wondering about these things out loud, these seem to have been concerns. I don't understand at all if they resonate with you. So it says, when those with boastful hearts proliferated, dispute proliferated in the community of Israel. And when the students of Rabbi Shammai and the students of Rabbi Hillel, who had not served their teachers sufficiently, in other words, they hadn't been properly trained in the methodology we're about to learn, arguments increased in Israel, and the Torah became like two Torahs. In other words, the community split. And now there was a sense of my side and your side. There was the red Torah and the blue Torah, and nobody could find the purple one. Just picked colors that I like. So what was Shammai and Hillel's method? Look at text 5. I should give you a little context. Those of you who aren't familiar with the Talmud, Talmudic literature is by definition a debate society. It's a debate that's taking place over about 500-600 years. So there are pages of the Talmud that I read where Rabbi so-and-so is arguing with a rabbi 3 generations before he ever lived. It's not about the personalities, it's about the argument, it's about the concept, it's about the idea that's being developed. Hillel and Shammai had a very famous argument. Would it have been better for God to create people or never to have? Well, so the argument over the centuries is actually not about whether God should have allowed us to live, but what is human nature? And what do you do with people who are good versus people who aren't good? And this conversation isn't solved in one little gathering. This is a generational conversation. It goes on to this very day. So Talmudic discourse and Talmudic debate is about entering into a sea of dialogue and conversation. I have a very good friend who says to me, I'm going to take the next hour and have a conversation with my great friends, and then he names all these ancient sages. He says, I feel like they're my friends because we're always arguing with each other. You enter into this ongoing conversation. So there are many, many, many examples in the literature. The literature is far-ranging, but I've just picked a couple for our point here. So this is now text number 5. A rabbi named Abba said that a man named Shmuel said, we always quote in the name of the person who's being referred to, for 3 years, Beit means the house of Shammai, and Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, disagreed. For 3 years they had a standing disagreement. The law is in accordance with your opinion, said these, and the law is accordant with our opinion. So they disagree. It doesn't matter what they were disagreeing about for our purposes tonight, but this guy said the law is this guy said the law is that, and for 3 years they argued about this. And they were both absolutely convinced in the rightness, the correctness of their determination. And they argued until ultimately a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, "Both these and those are words of the living God. You're both correct. You're both reflecting something that is true. However, the law is in accordance with the opinion of the house of Hillel." I mean, if it's a legal question, somebody has to make a decision. You both have good opinions, you both have good views, fair argument, but we got to make a decision. So I respect both arguments. Both of these are the words of the living God, but we're going to rule according to the house of Hillel. So the Talmudic discussion asks, since both these and those are the words of the living God, why was the house of Hillel privileged to have the law established with their opinion? Was it on the merits of the law? In this vision here that a divine voice spoke, did God actually think they were more correct than the other? I don't think so, because he said this and that are the words of the living God. So why were they the ones who were victorious in the legal argument? Well, the reason is that they were genial and modest, showing restraint when affronted, and when they taught the law, they would teach both their own statements and the statements of the house of Shammai. Moreover, when they formulated their teachings and cited a dispute, they prioritized the statements of the house of Shammai to their own statements in deference to the house of Shammai, just like they do it in Congress today. So what do we take from this? What do we take from this? This is a remarkable statement about how to argue. It's a remarkable statement about how to argue. And regardless of religious tradition or background, we can all relate to what's being said here. When you have an argument, the first rule is respect that each side has a legitimate opinion. Respect it so much that actually, before I cite my opinion, I want to understand yours and cite yours and record yours. Give respect to the opposition. Honor the opposition. And according to this text, by showing that sense of dignity and fairness and humanity, you may just win the day in terms of the substance of the argument. Or some compromise may be hit, or what have you. It's really a remarkable statement. Now, I have a couple questions here just for fun. How can two different ideas both be the word of the living God? What do you think? How can two different ideas, and this is in a religious context, they're interpreting the Bible, they're interpreting religious law that they understand out of the Bible, so maybe there ought to be a right and a wrong. How can both be the words of the living God? Okay, David says maybe there's the literal reading of it versus more of an interpretation to it that I might want to bring. Okay. Right. Or a sense, yeah, please, Rasha. Context. Okay. Inga?
Conditions.
Circumstances, conditions, okay. Or simply the fact that, you know what? This happens to be the way I read the text. This happens to be the way I would interpret it, but I'm humble enough to tell you that's really just my reading. What's your reading? And your reading is not necessarily less valid than my reading. I said this earlier, right? Am I diminished by accepting that you have a good idea? I don't think so. Right? So the text values respect, as we said, in debate and disagreement. And why do you think the law is decided on the basis of moral virtue rather than something more intrinsically obvious in the law? In other words, God doesn't come down in this story and say, oh, they're legally correct. God comes down and says, I like both of your arguments, but they behave better. They behave better. How to have an argument is about temperament. and human decency and respect, then you can have an argument. You and I have all had, with good friends or family members, really lovingly difficult arguments. But the love allowed us to have the talk. So, let's look at page 4. Because expanding on this idea comes a statement of Jewish law. The Mishnah is a statement of Jewish law. And with this, I'm going to introduce an American and a democratic concept. So the Mishnah says, why do we record the words of an individual among the many when the law is according to the words of the majority, right? So we said that Hillel and Shammai both spoke properly, but only one was to be chosen as the law. But then we were told that Hillel recorded Shammai's opinions before it recorded its own. So these people are asking why. And they say it's a legal system because if the court sees fit, the words of the individual, it may rely on them. In other words, those of you who are the attorneys in the room, you know that you bring precedents. You try to cite some previous legal precedent to make your case on behalf of your cause or your client. And the court can look at any number of precedents. And in this world of precedents, what was the majority opinion today may in fact not stand in the next court sitting, and the minority view may in fact become the decision. And so it's there recorded as a valid, equal option, just not at the first moment the choice made. This is called, in democratic theory, the tyranny of the minority. James Madison writes a lot about the tyranny of the minority in the Federalist Papers. The tyranny of the minority is the idea that if a majority is to rule, and if majority election is to survive, it has to respect the place and the views of the minority. It can't quash them, it can't push them away, it can't denigrate them, because the majority culture then takes over to the degree that the minority doesn't feel welcome anymore in that society. So he's worried in the Federalist Papers. I'll read just his words for a moment. This is James Madison in Federalist 10, written in 1787. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. Because of human passions, in turn, we have divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. That was in 1787, not 2019. Not much has changed in just the way we live our country. And then he talks about a minority faction has to be given voice and even sway. But a majority faction, which should rule the day by virtue of an electoral system or a majority rule system, can't therefore ignore and negate the legitimacy of the minority point of view. That's what this statement in text number 6 was talking about. Let me make this now theological for a moment. Text number 7. This is an interesting discussion. It's about a story in the book of Judges where there's a woman who's known as the concubine of Judah, and she comes to a very sad end. And there's a dispute about her behavior and who was with her and how she should be treated, and we're not going to read the book of Judges this evening. But in the end, it's really a very difficult, and she comes to a very cruel death. And so the interpretations of that story, the rabbinic vision of that story, wonders, did God think that was okay? Did God think they behaved okay? And so we have this interesting statement. This rabbi named Aviatar asked him, and what is God saying about that event? And he's talking to Elijah the prophet, an important figure in Jewish religious tradition, a biblical prophet. Elijah said to him that God is saying the following: Aviatar, my son, says this, and Jonathan, my son, says that. Same argument. One guy's arguing that this is the reason or the answer, and one guy is arguing the opposite. And Rabbi Aviatar said to Elijah, God forbid, God has doubts? God has doubts? Doesn't God actually know what happened? Why does God mention both opinions? And here comes the same quote we saw before. Because Elijah said to him, both these and those are the words of the living God. If you're going to have a constructive debate, if you're going to have an honest disagreement, you simply have to make room for each other. Easier said than done. And this is clearly not a new circumstance, because these texts are thousands of years old. This is human condition. This is human nature. All right, so I want to summarize for a minute where we've been. I want to show you quickly one or two other quick things, and then we can have some questions and dialogue for a little bit longer. All right, so we saw the right to question authority in the biblical texts. But then we saw that that right to question human authority, as the Jewish religious tradition understands it, is tempered by a sense of arrogance versus humility. You have to be challenging authority for a reason that isn't about you. You have to be challenging authority for some moral vision of where we're headed. And when you do that, you have to be respectful enough of those who differ with you to understand that that's a legitimate point of view. I just don't happen to share it. Here are my reasons. And let's talk about that. And let's figure that out. And it will be difficult, and it may not come to easy solution, but we'll be liking each other while we do it. We'll be respecting each other while we do it. Talmudic tradition even says that the house of Shammai allowed its children to marry the house of Hillel's children. We're allowed to be family. We're allowed to be close. We're allowed to care for each other. We just happen to have different opinions. Does it work that way in your family? Work that way around the Thanksgiving table in your family? We're allowed to have different opinions and still love each other. I asked one of those either-or questions earlier. Right? Can I respect you and like you even though you oppose what I support or you support what I oppose? Dawn Unity is all about that concept. We come from different life experiences and faith visions and perspectives, and yet we can love each other and grow to understand each other and actually civilly disagree with each other. It's okay. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, we say in Hebrew. This and that is the word of the living God. I just don't know how to translate that into American political theory. But in a religious context, as a moral vision, I completely understand it. And since, as I said earlier, our purpose in studying religious texts is to inform social values, I think this is a really necessary value to understand and to try to propagate in our circles of friends, among our colleagues and neighbors, and somehow into the culture in which we are living. We've always lived in that culture. It's just particularly tense at the moment. So, which one should we do? Okay, well, this one is just too much fun. So we're going to do this, and then I'm going to go to my closing text. So this is my Ner Tamid friends in the room. Once upon a time, you studied this with me. You're all forgiven for not remembering. That was many years ago. This is a classic of Jewish debate, this particular story. This is a very whimsical and important story. It's again a Talmudic statement. So let me set it up for you. We're in a study house. Looks just like this beautiful church. And in the middle here is a big table around which we're all sitting as opposed to these lovely pews. And there's this wall here, and there's that wall there, and we're sitting in the middle. That's important for the story to visualize that. So thank you, Jonathan. It's the perfect setting for this story. And we're arguing about such an arcane, irrelevant piece of law that I'm not even telling you what we're arguing about. It just doesn't matter. Ever had an argument where it actually doesn't matter? So this is one of those. I'm not even going to tell you what they're arguing about because it's so arcane and it just doesn't matter. What matters is the argument. So the sages taught, on that day, when they discussed this matter, doesn't matter what it is, but on that day, when they were talking about it, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the other rabbis, the majority, did not accept his explanations. Now, I need to tell you one thing that you won't know. Rabbi Eliezer, in matters of the law they're talking about, he's the expert. He knows it better than anybody. If he says it this way, he's right. He just is. He has studied it more. He has mastered it more. He has been proven more often. He's the guy you go to for this question. So he's bringing every possible answer he can bring to share with his colleagues that what he's saying is correct. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. So imagine just out this window, there's these beautiful shrubs, and all of a sudden one of them uproots from the dirt and moves back 400 feet. And Rabbi Eliezer says, see? I'm right. What does that mean? What is that telling me in the story? How is that a proof for Rabbi Eliezer's opinion? He's given up on the logical persuasion, so he's calling in some other help. What does that mean? How does a carob tree get uprooted and moved? It means God is saying he's right. Okay, I would be impressed. Wouldn't you be impressed? The rabbi said to him, one does not cite legal proof from the carob tree. What do you guys want from me? So Rabbi Eliezer said to them, okay, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. And the water in the stream turned backward and began flowing in the opposite direction. That would get my attention. What do you want from me? Clearly, I'm right. And they said to him, one does not cite legal proof from a stream. So Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinions, the wall of the study hall will prove it. And the walls of the study hall leaned in and began to fall. See this beautiful curve here? Protecting the stream. The walls started to collapse on these people sitting in the middle of the room. And Rabbi Joshua scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of law, what is the nature of your involvement in this dispute? He's yelling at God. Stay out of it. Stay out of it? So the Talmud relates, the walls did not fall because of the deference due Rabbi Joshua, but they did not straighten up because of the deference due Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning. So poor Rabbi Eliezer is truly right in the law, but his colleagues won't hear it, and they've asked God to stay out of the equation, but Rabbi Eliezer won't take that. So his last try, he says to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. And a divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the law is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion? God says to these people, he's always right. What are you arguing about? And if you knew what they were arguing about, you would go, really, what are you arguing about? And what's the answer? Rabbi Joshua stood on his feet and said, it is written in Scripture, it is not in heaven. There's the text, Deuteronomy. Surely this instruction which I enjoin upon you this day is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It is not in the heavens. The revelation has been given to humanity. It is now ours. So the Talmud asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, "it is not in heaven," in this context? And a rabbi named Jeremiah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote in the Torah, after a majority to incline. Since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the law is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. What's remarkable about this is a fanciful story, it's a wonderful story, but what's remarkable about this story is even though he's right, it's not what the majority is choosing, and therefore, it's not always about being right. It's just not always about being right. You're convinced of your opinion. You're convinced of your position. You know better. But if nobody else or the majority of folks don't want to get along with you on that, there's something else at play. It's called society. It's called community. It's called family. It's called children. Because in the end, does it really matter which choice was made? Now, sometimes it might. But in most of the debate, does it really matter? Isn't there a way to be respectful of one another? So look how this ends. Page 5, this is how it ends. The Talmud relates, years after, a rabbi named Nathan encountered again Elijah the prophet and said to him, "What did the Holy One, blessed be God, do at that time when Rabbi Joshua issued his declaration?" And Elijah said to him, "The Holy One, blessed be God, smiled and said, 'My children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. They got it. I gave it to them. I gave them the laws. I gave them the revelation. I am present in their midst, and they totally own it. And it's for them to figure out what to do." Really powerful statement. Even in a disagreement, it's not always necessarily about being right. Sometimes it will have to be, but not always.
Israel, his enemies, argument has made me, God says, has made me eternal. Because his word is eternal.
Nice. Very nice. Right, good. Right, very nice. So I want to do one last thing with you as a summary of what I want to present, and then I'm happy to share any comments or questions for a few minutes together. And that's this text number 10 at the bottom. So I've taken you on a little tour of Jewish tradition, wherein in the Talmudic literature you've seen how rabbis debate, and you've seen that rabbis have set out a culture or a set of values as to how to have these arguments. All right, so this text comes along and says, there's a rabbi named Elazar ben Azariah, and he taught that the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai sharply disagreed on matters of Jewish law. That we've seen. And so we ask, if the Torah is given by a single God, how is it the case that there exist differing interpretations? If there's one God, and God has given his law to the world, and God has revealed God's essence to the world, and we have the revelation, how can we read it differently? How can there be different views of it? And he answers what I think is the ultimate solution for all of us. Make for yourselves a heart of many rooms, and bring into it the words of the house of Shammai and the words of the house of Hillel. Can we do that? Can we create communities and a society where our hearts have many rooms? And in those rooms, we can make room for those with whom we agree, for those with whom we disagree. And can we hold our positions and hold our principles and hold our beliefs and hold our values and still in our hearts find a place for those who think or live differently? If we can, we will resolve so many of the tensions in front of us. And if we can't, then we will continue like those earlier rabbis, to divide into camps and to not show the humility and the respect necessary to really have an argument, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, to be able to go forward towards some greater vision. Thank you all. I'll take a comment or two, Frank.
Rabbi, they go into the room at the end. They both have their opinion.
Yeah.
But you need one solution. You can't have two solutions in my mind.
Right.
Tell me what happens.
Right, well, so that's exactly what they said. So the majority ruled, even though the minority voice was correct according to the story, but the majority chose to rule the opposite. Okay? Just like we saw when Hillel and Shammai differed and both had these views and both were the words of the living God, but the law will be according to Hillel, because you do have to have a decision. And why was the law according to Hillel? Because his was the morally more proper way of treating the people he was arguing with. Thank you. Any other question, comment? Please, what's your name? Hi, Sue. Try not to have them.
Well, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'll repeat it.
Yeah, Ron, can you repeat?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. I don't think she's finished asking it yet. Oh, that's it. Okay. Okay. So Sue's question is, okay, that's very nice when you're having an argument that we're calling here for heaven's sake. What happens when you're in the midst of an argument that, to use the language that I brought this evening, is not for heaven's sake? How do you have that argument? So my personal response would be to do your very best to turn it into an argument for heaven's sake, which would mean pulling out a little bit, asking about desired outcomes, asking what we're after, trying to transform that argument into the kind of argument that might be for heaven's sake. And I know it's difficult, and our passions are involved, and all sorts of things are on the line depending what we're arguing about. But if you really don't think the argument can be productive and constructive, then just disengage. We'll get to it another time, or maybe the mood will change, but that would be the way I would choose to think about it. Larry?
Do you think the decline in religious practice and those who consider themselves not part of any religious position has had an effect on this types of discourse and the way
Jonathan Reinhardt, do you think that the decline in religious affiliation has had any impact on the way we argue in this society? He's saying no. He's saying no. I'm going to agree no. Because here's why. Unfortunately, and I will not speak on behalf of any other religious tradition, but my Jewish friends in the room understand that our community has an argument or two. And we're not always so respectful like these ideals I brought you tonight. And we're not always so accepting of the other point of view. I mean, have you noticed that? I've noticed that a little bit. So I would argue that these things are hard, regardless of your religious or secular or worldview. These things are hard, which is why they're in sacred text. Which is why they're set out for us as ideals to strive for, which is why these models exist. Do I really know how they debated back then? Do I really think they all got along and it was loving? I suspect there were some pretty vicious moments. There always are in human dynamics. But they wanted to pass on to us a vision of something better. And that, I think, is something aspirational for all of us, religious or not. Please, your name, please. Hi, Charlie. Yeah.
And Atticus tells Scott, you have to walk in someone else's skin. 50 years later, Aaron Sorkin wrote the play.
Yep.
And he said that, you can't walk in a racist skin. You can't walk in Eichmann's moccasins.
Yep.
If he wore moccasins.
Yeah.
And the thing is that sometimes in the society we live in today,
Right.
where we deal with big life, I think you have to step up and say, you can't
Good.
accept
Good.
another person's opinion.
Good, I think that's great. So I want to point out that in the examples I brought, his concern is that you can't always accept somebody else's opinion. If a racist opinion is brought to you, you don't have to state there and say, yeah, that's also an equally valid opinion. You can't do that, right? So a very important statement. So that's why I think the text went to the point of saying the decision was based on moral virtue. If in fact the statement is not valid, if the facts don't support it, if it comes from a place of racism or xenophobia or something else, you have every right to stand against that. Then you go to the Abraham mode and you say, shame on you. That is not an acceptable position. That's absolutely legitimate. We're not going to solve every argument, and we're not going to, I would say, we don't argue with people whose opinion isn't worthy of engaging with. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true. Nevertheless, most of the time, we're not in those situations, and we're not in the jury and To Kill a Mockingbird. So in our closer, more common kinds of conversations, I think there's license here. But I share that. I agree with you on that.
Well, you haven't met my sister.
I'll look forward to the opportunity. Gail.
So our Constitution was written by people, and all men are created equal, and there, again, that was not a religion,
Yeah.
that was a colloquial.
Yeah.
And then we decided that, yes, all men are created equal. So,
We're still working that one out, but yes, I hope we're there. I hope we're there. Yeah. No, that's right. Things do change over time, and there is an arc in history to these kinds of things. We could do this exact same talk tonight with American literature, with the Federalist Papers, with constitutional theory, with court decisions. We could do, and you could do the same talk with Christian literature. You could do the same talk with Muslim. We could do this same talk. I happen to know Jewish literature best, so that's what I brought you tonight. Right? But absolutely, it's not that these ideas aren't universally present in all of our experiences. They are, and they're just as equally difficult to achieve in all of our experiences. Thus, we're thinking about it still. But you're absolutely right. Eve?
This is not a question. This is really that I want to thank you for giving us this text, because I think most of us in this room, this was a very stark reminder for all of us in these trying times that we are living in, to go back to our source and begin to understand that we can live together and disagree in a way that is not so disagreeable.
Good. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll leave that as the last word. They're not either or choices, my friends. They're and both choices. There's room for us. Our hearts can have many rooms. We can agree to disagree and get along. Thank you all.